Ronda Rousey, pioneer of women's MMA, former Bantamweight champion and celebrity, returns to the cage this weekend in what could be the beginning of her second dominant phase as champion, or possibly her last fight. Whatever you think of her, or of combat sports, if you get a chance, I urge you to watch her fight against reigning Bantamweight champion, the Brazilian Amanda Nunes. The main event at UFC 207 will be high drama from the moment Rousey walks out, furrowed brow, her face articulating the definition of fighting mean. To know that this external expression is a physical manifestation of her inner determination and focus, rather than some kind of play acting, makes her entrance even more engaging. As Bruce Buffer hops out of the octagon, you can be sure it won't only be Nunes and Rousey whose blood will be pumping in excitement. Even if you aren't an MMA mark as I am, you might feel a rush of adrenaline as referee Herb Dean shouts, "Fight!" But even if the fighting doesn't interest you, you'll surely be aware that Rousey is an iconic public figure who has prided herself on being entirely self-made. You might think that Rousey embodies female empowerment, that a dominant pioneer like herself must be a feminist who champions the rights of women to be given equal treatment, or to be paid the same as men. It's more complicated than that. Although many have lionized her as a triumph for feminism, she has never described herself as a feminist, nor would she. In fact, she shows little solidarity in this solemn sport, where loyalty is shown towards one's training stable and towards the corporate hand that is ensuring a good life. In 2011, Dana White, the Trump-supporting president of the UFC, famously stated that while he was running the organization, women would never participate in the UFC. Less than a year later, he signed and brought out Ronda to the media. Aside from the official press conference unveiling, the first time the UFC introduced Ronda Rousey to the MMA audience was during an Ultimate Fighter episode in 2012. It was an awkward introduction. She walked into the house full of male fighters hoping to fight their way to a UFC contract, already crowned as the UFC's new Bantamweight champion without having fought a fight in the UFC. But in MMA circles, nobody doubted that she was the real deal, and she proved this by disposing of every single fighter put in front of her, usually in the first round. The only fighter who provided any kind of resistance was Meisha Tate. The unanswered question was always, how brilliant is Ronda, or how bad is the rest of the Bantamweight division? Or was she both brilliant and her competition poor? The UFC was rapidly running out of opponents for Ronda until she faced Holly Holm in November 2015, who knocked her out with the head kick that dethroned her. Although many in the MMA media claim to have predicted that Rousey might have difficulty facing Holm, the truth was that almost nobody expected Holm, who had a number of very average performances, to school Rousey. It was a complete shock to Rousey and the MMA world to witness that dramatic fight, which was as close to humiliation as you can find inside an MMA cage. During her reign, Rousey became a household name, and over the past year she has vanished from the sport. Although she has appeared in movies and has become a well-known crossover celebrity, now she's back. But what of Ronda's views from a social justice or feminist perspective? Well, she was a supporter of Bernie Sanders. She was also accused of transphobia for saying that Fallon Fox, a trans MMA fighter, might have, quote, chopped her pecker off, but shouldn't be able to fight in the UFC. She is also on record for making disparaging remarks about women who essentially have much less get up and go than she has, referring to them as do-nothing women, who she believes need a man to take care of them financially or otherwise. From my perspective, she is on stronger ground when she attacks celebrities like Kim Kardashian for related reasons. Sure, Rousey knows she herself is a celebrity, but she is that because she actually excelled at something. She's also got into spats with other women in the sport, slamming Octagon girl Ariane Celeste. It appears as if Rousey has no respect or even an active dislike of other women if she believes their success is due to their looks rather than effort. But this conflict with Ariane is connected to another issue that Rousey injected when attacking Celeste, that of fighter pay. Ronda stated her belief that the ring girls should not be paid more than fighters, a view that certainly rings true among fighters and probably most of the public. Then again, many people think that teachers and doctors should be paid more than bankers or company executives. But some pointed out how Ronda is much happier talking about who should get less money rather than argue that fighters should be paid more. This is a separate topic, but people should understand that once most successful fighters have retired, they will have to find a new job, and often suffer health problems they incurred whilst entertaining us. Only the likes of Ronda and Conor McGregor will be able to retire and not have to worry about money again. Somebody that truly cared about the wages of fighters would not bother criticizing Octagon girls, who are not paid more than most fighters. They would use their power to advocate on behalf of fighters. So what of Ronda's position on female MMA fighters' pay? Her view is that you are paid what you are worth, that this is connected to how much money you bring in for the UFC. Ronda claims that she is very well paid because she, quote, brings in the highest numbers. If women are paid poorly, it is because people are not interested in watching them. While there is a certain amount of truth in that position, it is disingenuous. To begin with, her statement implies that she brought something to the UFC. The fact is that until the organization brought her in, nobody outside of hardcore combat sports fans knew who she was. The UFC spent hundreds of thousands of dollars promoting and marketing her within its own organization, but in the wider media too. As a heavily marketed woman in MMA, she was a novelty, and probably the first female most non-fight fans had ever heard of. The fact that she was a woman in what was seen as a male sport worked in her favor and brought more eyeballs, whether it was women who identified with her or from men who wanted to ogle her. So, whilst it's true that Rousey claims that her rival in the sport has benefited the UFC, it's also true that without the UFC's promotion of her specifically, that there would be no women in the UFC and that Ronda would be struggling to earn a living, as many former Olympians do. Evidence of the lack of meritocracy in women's MMA is shown concerning Paige VanZant. Paige has been promoted as the huge next big thing by the UFC. First things first, she is no Ronda, but she is a very good fighter, and there is no question that she belongs in the UFC and will likely one day fight for the strawweight title belt. But long before she became a celebrity, Paige was signed by Reebok in a contract likely worth hundreds of thousands of dollars after just one fight, while the then reigning strawweight champion Carla Esparza had no such contract offer. Paige now headlines UFC events, and thus is paid more, even though there are many female fighters in her division who are higher ranked and have received no such treatment. I will leave you to decide why this might be. It's also worth mentioning that for media appearances, female MMA fighters are encouraged by UFC top brass to come to pre-fight press conferences wearing sexy attire, complete with high heels and heavy makeup. Let me be sincere. When I watch MMA, even attractive female MMA fighters, sex is the furthest thing from my mind. Call me a pathetic one-dimensional male, but I can't help feeling somewhat differently when these same fighters come dressed in clubwear. Then there are the nicknames of highly skilled fighters like Michelle Waterson, also known as the Karate Hottie. I'm not gonna lie. This makes me cringe and conflicts the hell out of me. Yes, the UFC reflects the world and the sexualization of women, or at least the expectations of the mainly male UFC audience, but these are serious athletes for God's sake. I know it's about promotion and money, but isn't it a little humiliating that gender or sexuality has to be pushed like this Not only on those athletes who feel like they have to push it, but what does it say about the rest of us? The existence of the Octagon Girls provides further proof of the way women have traditionally been looked at in combat or full contact sports. They are there to look pretty and to support the male athletes. But the arrival of women as fighters in the UFC, it seems to be a fair question as to what the role of the Octagon Girls is. Is it a poor message to be sending in the 21st century to have women paid to strut around between rounds based on their sexual attractiveness? Should we also have octagon men too? Is the real quote-unquote feminist position not actually to get rid of octagon girls as archaic and demeaning, but to embrace the variety of options open to women? You can fight if you're good enough, you can be a cut man or cut woman, you can be an octagon girl, you can be anything you like. I have no easy reply, but the appearance of women's weight divisions has made me ask myself this question. But we know what the octagon girls imply. They exist to entertain or titillate a mainly male audience, whose attention spans may be flagging between rounds. The appearance of women's divisions has caused a peak in women's interest in MMA. If at any stage UFC executives believe that their female fanbase don't want octagon girls or require octagon boys, then changes will be made. Don't hold your breath though. Combat sports are still overwhelmingly watched by men. Boxing has had many years to develop, has female divisions, although male and female events are kept separate, and yet ring girls still exist, and a cursory glance at the crowd will always show you far more men than women at the money-spinning male boxing events. While female boxers struggle to make a living, male boxers can earn astronomical sums that most MMA fighters can only dream of. To be fair, it's not just women who are hyped on the basis of their looks. Sage Northcutt, an Adonis-like figure, aptly described as corny as fuck by one of his recent opponents, received a huge amount of hype and was given easy opponents to beat until the wheels fell off. Northcutt has lost 2 out of his last 3 fights, but at least he doesn't feel like he should call himself Sexy Boy Northcutt. And at least we don't have greased up men in tight shorts waltzing around between rounds. Or should I be demanding this? But to return to what I used to call the Rousification of women's MMA. They concentrated all their resources in promoting Rousey to the detriment of other female fighters, who were overlooked. Not only did this mean that the vast majority of women were being paid peanuts to fight on UFC cards, this was also a short-sighted business decision, which might have threatened the existence of women's MMA because, as we all witnessed, Rousey would sooner or later lose. And before Rousey, there was little public appetite, certainly among hardcore fans, to watch women's MMA. Fortunately, the strawweight division produced a highly skilled and charismatic champion in Joanna Jędrzejczyk. We see the same Rousification for this weekend's fight against Nunes. Amanda Nunes is the first openly gay UFC champion, with a great backstory, and yet almost all of the pre-fight hype is focused on Ronda. It's a short-term calculation by the UFC hierarchy, gambling that Ronda will win. If Ronda loses, this was a huge missed opportunity to market one of their champions, to remind the public that the women's game is exciting and worth sticking around for. It's worth mentioning some other female pioneers in MMA. There is the unfortunate Kim Winslow, the first woman to referee a UFC fight. After making a few mistakes, she seems to have been dropped from refereeing UFC fights altogether. Considering the number of ridiculous mistakes referees such as Eve Levine have made, this seems harsh in my view. But my favourite pioneer is the first and only cut woman in MMA history, Swayze Valentine. She worked her way to the top in a male-dominated profession by turning up at fight stables and asking to wrap the hands of fighters. Even when she established a reputation, there are many confirmed stories of how some fighters or trainers refused to let her work with them on the basis of her gender. But the thing that sets my empathy glands into overdrive is watching Swayze work just before the fighters climb onto the stage. Not only is she doing the job professionally, as the other cut men do, But it's as if she's a fan, someone who admires the sacrifices made by the fighters, someone who feels privileged to be part of the event and enjoys and soaks in every moment. So, the truth is that Ronda sees herself as a fighter who feels as if she has earned the right to transcend her gender. She has no sympathy for other women who don't succeed because she fought against the odds and made it. She is a person who owes more loyalty to the UFC brass and her stable than to the other fighters who are her rivals. Do I have a prediction? Well, Ronda is coming off a long layoff in MMA terms, and although the bantamweight division is still the weakest division in the UFC, the standard has increased. Following her defeat by Holly Holm, Nunes' trainers will surely be using a similar method. Avoid the takedown at all costs and punch her in the face and body for good measure. It appears as if Ronda hasn't changed her much criticised trainers, with Edmund Tarvedian, a man who has been embroiled with numerous controversies, including having his cornering license revoked. He has also been the target of public attacks in the media by Ronda's mother. More importantly, Ronda's stable has a poor record in producing decent fighters. On the other hand, some claimed the first defeat by Holm might be due to distractions she had by trying to carve out a side career in acting and some other issues. The longer layoff would have been necessary after such a potentially psychological damaging defeat, though. Unless the Hayston Academy has brought in secret outside help, more of the same is expected from Ronda, with slight improvements in her boxing and cardio. Will that be enough? If it stays on the feet, these improvements won't be enough, and Ronda could either be knocked out or beaten by decision over 5 rounds. If Rousey manages to get Nunes on the ground, she may again win by submission, armbar, perhaps in the later rounds. It would be foolish to bet against Rousey, but it's equally foolish to expect different results if you don't make changes in your game following a defeat. So, could there be more feminism in MMA? And could Ronda be considered a feminist? Well, there could certainly be some changes in attitudes towards women in MMA and combat sports, but this all depends on profit incentives, because it is the only language that executives running combat sports understand. The same could be said about Rousey herself. Certainly she could be considered a feminist, but I don't consider her one, because Ronda is all about Ronda. That is no criticism. This is the mentality of fighters looking after number one. But the quality of the individual shows once you have made it, when you can afford to speak your mind. This is a luxury that few can afford. And I would like to think that even if she is somewhat allergic to supporting women as a group, that one day she will stand up for her fellow fighters, male and female, to receive proper compensation for the dangerous sport that they participate in. Her loyalty should be to her peers, rather than to corporate bigwigs.